Today, Saturday 13th April, I'm going to start my video again today with a brief discussion of the situation in the Middle East. And once more, despite lots of expectations, despite lots of reports and claims, we have had no Iranian attack on Israel, no Iranian attack so far on Israeli positions by Iran. Now, there has been a most interesting, very strange article appearing in the Financial Times. And the Financial Times, as I've discussed on many occasions, is a particularly pertinent newspaper to follow because it does seem to have a close connection in some form with the Biden administration and seems to be very well informed about the Biden administration's strategic thinking. Anyway, this article appears to suggest that there are ongoing contacts and discussions underway between the United States and Iran, and that the United States has quietly accepted that Iran, for political reasons, has no alternative but to respond robustly to the Israeli attack on the Iranian embassy building in Damascus, but that the terms of that attack are being negotiated between the Iranians and the Americans, with the Israelis being kept in the loop. And the idea that seems to be developing is that the Iranians will launch some kind of missile strike, perhaps involving a new missile whose capability the Iranians can thereby demonstrate, but that the attack will take place against targets of which Israel and the United States have been informed in advance, and from which civilians and military personnel will have been evacuated, so that there will be no casualties, no actual casualties as a result of the Iranian attack. Now, if this all sounds utterly bizarre, it is not entirely unlike what happened following the American assassination of the Iranian military leader, Brigadier General Soleimani, in Baghdad. The Iranians and the Americans got in touch with each other through, with the help of the Swiss. It was the Swiss who provided the information, which went backwards and forwards. The Iranians then launched some certain missile strikes against American military bases in Iraq, but they made absolutely sure that the bases did not hit buildings where American military personnel were stationed, so that the bases themselves were hit, but that no one actually was killed as a result. So we've had precedent for this. Now, let's go to that article, because my description of it is, of course, based on my own interpretations. But let's start with the title. It begins by saying that Iran signals calibrated retaliation to Israeli strike. And the subtitle says that Tehran indicates response will be designed to avoid escalating conflict amid flurry of diplomatic calls. And then we have an initial paragraph. Iran has signaled to allies and Western nations, allies, of course, being the Chinese and the Russians, that it will retaliate against a suspected Israeli airstrike on its Damascus consulate in a calibrated manner to keep an all-out regional conflict at bay, according to officials briefed on the talks. So that tells us that there are talks underway. Tehran is unlikely to target Israeli diplomatic facilities in the region, said an official, briefed on talks between Iran and Oman. Oman looks like it's acting this time in place of the Swiss as the intermediary. And where the article then goes on to tell us that Oman, Gulf state that has often acted, have often facilitated back-channel diplomacy between Tehran and Washington. And then we go on to read, US intelligence on any impending attack appears to be detailed and specific according to the officials briefed on the situation, giving Israel a window to prepare its defenses. Now, that suggests that the Iranians are briefing the Americans on the likely targets. And then we go on to read the diplomatic calls this week between Iran and its regional allies and European capitals. So, other countries in Europe, EU countries, have also been contacted, have led at least some Western officials to conclude that Iran is preparing a response that aims to demonstrate deterrent strength, whilst also showing restraint. And then, interestingly, we switch and we're told something that we're informed has been provided, information that's been provided by a regime insider in Tehran. It's not clear whether this person, whoever he or she is in direct contact with the Financial Times, or whether this person is speaking to either Oman or the Europeans or someone. But anyway, this is what the Financial Times then goes on to say. One regime insider in Tehran said it was ready to bide its time to maximize the political impact of the ultimate response. Iran was deliberately seeking to exhaust Israel, both by creating psychological uncertainty and forcing Israel to remain on high alert. He added that Iran would employ a combination of options in its attacks against Iran without providing further details. And then we are told that Israel is indeed in a state of anxiety about these attacks. And then we're further informed, this is comes from Western officials, several factors may stop Iran trying to hit an Israeli diplomatic mission. Iran can't risk further international isolation by hitting Israeli diplomatic targets in a friendly country, and can't easily target Israeli diplomatic assets in unfriendly nations. It limits their choices, one Western official said. Maybe. Anyway, going on, even a direct attack on Israeli territory would probably be calibrated, the word calibrated always in quotation marks, in a manner that would show a robust response without triggering an Israeli retaliation that would lead to Iranian assets in Lebanon and Syria being decimated, the Western official said, while warning that a miscalculation is possible. And then we're told that Israel has prepared for any combination of attacks from medium-range rockets and drones launched by Ukrainian proxy militias in Lebanon and Syria to long-range missiles launched from further afield. And then the article tells us that Iran and Israel have actually, despite the rhetoric between them, been very careful to avoid entering direct confrontation to each other. We're then told that analysts and officials in Tehran have long warned of Prime Minister Netanyahu tried to goad Iran into a direct confrontation, which the regime seeks to avoid. And we're then told that Western officials say Israel might be able to tolerate an attack that only did some physical damage to military facilities. But if civilians or military personnel are killed, that would trigger a wider Israeli response. And then we're told that the United States has deployed assets to the region, and that a US General Michael Kurilla, the US's top commander in the Middle East, is in Israel meeting senior Israeli defense and military officials to help prepare for a possible military response. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin spoke with his Israeli counterpart on Thursday, and then the Pentagon tells us that he reiterated full US support to defend Israel against Iranian attacks. And lastly, we read that a Western official briefed on Iran's calls to regional allies. It's interesting that, these calls are information is being provided, said it was possible Iran would deploy new missile capability for the first time, demonstrating technical prowess and reach that would show it is capable of punishing Israel. So, possibly a negotiation going on. As the article concedes, there is huge risk of miscalculation, and one does wonder whether, if the United States really does want to keep the situation under control in the way that the Iranians apparently wish, probably it does, and whether, if so, it can control its Israeli allies. All that remains to be seen. But anyway, a very complicated game of diplomatic chess is being played as we all await Iran's big move. All very interesting and very typical, I have to say, of the way things are done in the Middle East. To reiterate again, all kinds of private agreements and understandings may have been reached. But when missiles fly, it is far from certain that the situation can be kept under control, and it would have been much better if we had avoided this whole situation altogether and had not had that militarily pointless attack on Iran's embassy in Damascus, which, to reiterate again, was an extreme provocation. Now, various people have made the point to me that, why, if its embassy hasn't been attacked, has Iran not approached the UN Security Council? The answer is it has. It has asked for a Security Council statement condemning Israel, and has said that if the Security Council were to issue such a statement, then Iran would not carry out an attack, a military strike against Israel. Well, there's been no word of anything of that kind coming from the Security Council. I think it is all but inconceivable that the United States would join in such a statement, though we are told, again, all this is anonymously, that the United States has assured Iran in private that it was not informed by Israel of the attack on the embassy building in Damascus, had no prior warning of it, and was not involved itself in any way. Anyway, it does look as if some kind of contacts and discussions are taking place, but the situation remains extremely dangerous. It's easy to see how one side or the other might miscalculate in this situation. And it's important to remember that there are undoubtedly parties on each side who probably would welcome a wider confrontation. And of course, in the case of Israel, they've clearly sought this because that is the only explanation for the attack on the diplomatic building in Damascus. Now, I say all of this, and the background, of course, is the continued conflict in Gaza. And we've now had a massive article in the Wall Street Journal, which comes very close to acknowledging that which people like Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, myself and my colleague Alex Christoforou on the Duran and on these programs, many others have said and have been saying all along from before this operation in Gaza began. The Wall Street Journal admits that despite Israel winning every skirmish and battle that it's been engaged in with Hamas fighters, by the way, I'm not entirely sure that is correct, but that's another matter. Israel, despite winning all the battles, is in real danger in Gaza of losing the war. The point I have made, the point many others have made, is that in order for Israel to achieve victory in Gaza, it must destroy Hamas, which is an all but impossible undertaking within any quantum of cost that would be possible given the current international situation. Whereas for Hamas, all it needs to do in this sort of conflict is to survive. And it looks as if, one way or the other, the end result of this conflict is that Hamas will still survive and will retain its political and military organization and its presence in Gaza. Well, this was predictable from the outset. I don't understand, again, why such basic errors of strategy were made. I do understand that there were pressures with Israel. I do understand that Israeli politics perhaps pushed in a certain direction. I also understand that there are some fervid people within the Israeli government, people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who dream of restoring Israeli control in Gaza, expelling the entire population, eventually re-establishing the temple in Jerusalem, converting Israel or making Israel, in the words of Alistair Crook, which I will never forget, establishing the state of Israel, the true state of Israel, within Israel. Well, those people have now run into enormous international and political opposition, including increasingly within the United States. Their objective has proved unachievable, as many said it would. And in terms of the original Hamas attack on Israel, consciously or not, and I'm fairly sure that it was done consciously, Hamas laid a trap and Israel fell into it. I have to make this point. The contrast between Israel's inability to resist an admittedly extreme provocation on the 7th of October and to act in a way that played directly into the hands of its enemies through a campaign in Gaza that has horrified the world. The contrast between that and the much more sophisticated way in which the Iranians have responded to the Israeli provocation in the form of the attack on their embassy tells us a great deal about the current situation between these two countries. And it suggests, at the very least, and as those who follow my programs will know, I am now choosing my words extremely carefully. It suggests, at the very least, a failure of Israeli and American statecraft. By contrast, a far superior level of statecraft in Tehran. Others would no doubt express things much more straightforwardly and much more forcefully, and they would be right to do so. Anyway, I will now move on. We now have a gathering crisis over Ukraine. It is becoming increasingly clear that the Ukrainians are losing the war, certainly east of the Dnieper. There is now hand-wringing and complaints, and one almost gets a sense of growing despair, both in Ukraine and in the West, as to the state that events are taking. Let me start firstly with Ukraine. I was reading firstly that I'm taking all of this from Redovka, but there's said to be an article in the British newspaper, the Daily Telegraph. I haven't been able to find it, but Redovka is citing the Daily Telegraph. It's a very bizarre situation, by the way, where I have to go to a Russian newspaper to find out what the Daily Telegraph is writing. But anyway, for the moment, I'm not able to locate this article. But we're told that a Ukrainian Special Forces commander, Pavel Kurilenko, has told the Daily Telegraph that Ukraine risks losing control of territories up to the Dnieper River after the expected Russian offensive in 2024. And according to Kurilenko, the reason for this is the failure of the West to provide Ukraine with all of the resources Ukraine needs in order to withstand this Russian offensive. So, an admission from a Ukrainian officer talking to the Daily Telegraph that Ukraine is at risk of losing the battle in eastern Ukraine, are being pushed back to the Dnieper River. It's not clear to me, by the way, that this article says that Ukraine is likely to pull back from every part of Ukraine east of the Dnieper River. But I'm going to make an observation here of my own. If the Russians do reach the Dnieper River in the central area of Ukraine, in other words, opposite Dnipro, and occupying presumably parts of Dnipro which are on the east bank of the Dnieper. If they reach the Dnieper in places like that, then it is very difficult for me to see, looking at a map, knowing the economic geography a bit, but also looking at the possible strategic positions, how the Ukrainians could hold on to all the territories, even places like Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernigov, and Poltava, that lie east of the Dnieper. The Ukrainian forces would at the very least be cut in two. Their lines of communication across the Dnieper would be threatened, and that's perhaps understating things. They would be facing attacks from multiple directions, from what would increasingly start to look like encircling Russian forces. And my own view is that if the Russians do reach the Dnieper in these central areas of Ukraine, then it is game over for the Ukrainian presence east of the Dnieper. Around 40% territorially of Ukraine would, over time perhaps, but inevitably, slip under Russian control. And for the record, the territory that the Russians would occupy east of the Dnieper would include most of Ukraine's more developed industrial and urban assets. And what would be left, a rump Ukraine west of the Dnieper, as I've discussed many times, economically speaking, would probably not be very viable. Anyway, that's Kurilenko talking to the Daily Telegraph. There's also another article, and I'm getting this now exclusively from the Russian media, specifically from Redovka, and it discusses the failure of the Ukrainian air defense systems in Kiev, their inability to protect the Tripilska thermal power plant located near Kiev. And the article references an engineer, a Ukrainian aviation engineer, Konstantin Krivolap, who apparently gave an interview to a Ukrainian television channel in which he explains why the KH-69, which was used apparently to destroy the Tripilska thermal power plant, got through, and that there was no way to defend against it. And this I'm taking now from Redovka. The expert emphasized that the air security of Kiev and the areas closest to the city is ensured with the help of US Patriot anti-aircraft systems. Krivolap added that other systems are also used for this, which receive data from satellites, interesting admission, as well as early warning aircraft. So that's already telling us some rather interesting things, which is that the Ukrainian air defense system has been operating with data inputs from Western, primarily, of course, American satellites. I think many people had figured that out for a long, long time, but also American and NATO AWACS aircraft operating presumably over NATO airspace, but perhaps even occasionally Ukrainian airspace as well, though that might be dangerous for them to do. And then Krivolap goes on to say that according to Krivolap, the cruise missiles that struck the thermal power plant flew very low above the surface due to the terrain scanning mode. It has a small thermal footprint and radar signature. Krivolap came to the conclusion that Kiev is currently experiencing a shortage of radars for air surveillance. And anyway, that is Krivolap. The air defense system has failed, and he's explained why the KH-69 presents significant problems. Now, after my program yesterday, one of the most insightful and expert of commentators who writes to me about matters, somebody with deep knowledge of aviation matters, expressed some doubt that the Russians would have used the Sukhoi 57 fifth generation stealth aircraft to launch this attack. It is undoubtedly the case that the KH-69 can be launched from other aircraft like the Sukhoi 34 and the Sukhoi 35, which are the mainstays of Russian aviation in Ukraine. This person pointed out that launching a missile in this kind of way, this kind of attack over a distance of 400 kilometers, is a boring mission, as he put it, for a fifth, and not one which really you would want to use an expensive fifth generation fighter jet, of which Russia still has only a relative few to carry out. And that on balance, it's more likely than not that it was done by more conventional Russian fighter jets. I accept that explanation. I'm not going to argue with that. So it's unlikely that the Sukhoi 57s were actually used in this attack. The only thing I would say about this, and this is not by way of response, by the way, but I've noticed that some Russian channels are also now claiming that it was Sukhoi 57s that launched these missiles that carried out that attack. But I'm guessing that they didn't sit down and analyze it in the way that this respondent has done. Probably they're also doing what I did yesterday, putting two together, which is the fact that the KH-69 was apparently specifically designed for use with the Sukhoi 57, put two and two together, and came came to 5. In other words, that because the KH-69 is designed to be used by the Sukhoi 57, that means that the Sukhoi 57, as opposed to some other aircraft, was actually used, when the actual facts rather suggest that, in fact, it was other aircraft that were used. Anyway, one way or the other, the Russians were able to destroy this big power station. And it is quite clear that they now have complete aerial dominance over Ukraine. As I discussed back in the autumn, the Russians have systematically destroyed Ukraine's air force. Over the course of the winter and the spring, they took apart most of Ukraine's air defense system. There are still some air defense positions left around Kiev itself, defending Kiev, and some also say Lviv in the west of the country. This is a major, not just a major town, which is of enormous political importance to Ukraine, but it is also the main logistical hub for a lot of the Western supplies that reach Ukraine. Anyway, those two places continue to be defended, but the rest of Ukraine, to all intents and purposes, is not. And we've had articles about this today in first the Financial Times and then the Guardian. I'm going to deal firstly with the Guardian. And the Guardian tells us that Ukraine air defense is overwhelmed as Russia pounds power stations. And the blame, of course, for all of this is not enormous military force by the Russians, enormous numbers of missiles. It all comes down, again, to the United States, the fact that the Republicans are not providing more funding for the United States to send more weapons. Anyway, let's just read a little bit of this article. Ukraine's air defenses are being overwhelmed by concentrated waves of Russian bombing aimed at its power stations, acknowledged the senior presidential advisor after the destruction of an entire plant on Thursday. Mikhailo Podolak said Moscow was adopting new tactics of attacking power stations with up to 10 or 12 missiles at a time, bypassing already stretched Patriot and other missile shields. Nowhere in this article is there an admission verified by photographic and film evidence and confirmed in a few articles which have also been squirreled away in parts of the American and European media, that in fact the Russians have been extremely successful over the last few weeks, destroying Patriot missile systems and destroying other Ukrainian air defense systems as well, and that that is one of the reasons why Ukraine is now desperately short of air defense assets. Anyway, we then go on to read from Podolyak saying the system is overloaded. Now we have to see whether we can keep the system running, whether we need more air defense systems, especially against anti-ultrasonic ballistic missiles, and whether we can restore the facilities. And then, again, the claim, never challenged in the West, but I think increasingly discredited, that Ukraine is able to shoot down hypersonic missiles, be it Kinzhals or Zircons. For the record, I've now come round to the view that all Ukrainian claims about shooting down Kinzhal hypersonic missiles were probably untrue. There were potential ways whereby it could have been done, or perhaps I should say theoretical ways whereby it could have been done. It's been explained to me in private how, if it got lucky, the Patriot might be able to shoot down a Patriot, a Kinjal missile in the minutes or seconds before it impacted on its target. But to be frank, I don't think this has ever happened. I think that if it had happened, we'd have seen a lot more evidence of it, and we never have really seen the kind of evidence that we would need. And it's clear that Kinjals are able to operate across Ukraine, essentially at will. And anyway, it is universally acknowledged by those who know about such things that there is no actual air defense system in existence anywhere on the planet that can intercept Zircon hypersonic scramjet cruise missiles. Anyway, no, to continue. We're told that the Tripilska coal and gas fired plant south of Kiev has been completely destroyed. We're also told, and this is interesting, by the way, that no staff were killed, which is extremely interesting. One wonders whether the Russians, again, went out of their way to avoid killing staff, whether they attacked parts of the power station where they knew people were unlikely to be. I'm not going to speculate about that. But we're told that it has lost 100% of its generating capacity. And there's a quote from the chair of the energy company, Centrenergo. The scale of destruction is terrifying. And this has come directly after the loss of the Zmiev power station near the city of Kharkiv. And we're also go on to read that the destruction means that nearby towns have lost their source of winter heating. Many homes rely on district systems for warmth during the winter. And we have a quote from someone called Anatol Shevchenko, a garage worker, saying that it was a relief that the attack took place in early April after the end of winter and during a period of unusually warm weather. Of course, Putin has just said that that was precisely why the Russians attacked the power stations, the Ukrainian power stations at this time. They intentionally waited until the winter cold had passed so as to mitigate the humanitarian effects. And anyway, we then go on to read that Podolak said Ukraine was urgently seeking help from its allies to better tackle the threat, and said that while Kiev had not yet run out of US-made Patriot and German IRIS-T air defense systems, it was running short of the critical munitions. They are definitely in deficit. Well, there we are. That's what Podolak is telling us. He appears to accept that there is now a critical situation in Ukraine as a result of these missile attacks. Now, the Financial Times has also told us more. It tells us that the Ukrainians have been hunting to try to get Patriot air defense missiles from across Europe. And the article reads, European countries rebuff Kiev's calls for more air defense systems. Germany has sent 2 Patriot systems to Ukraine, but is reluctant to give more. And then the Financial Times goes on to say, European capitals have rebuffed demands from Kiev to send their air defense systems to Ukraine after a week of relentless missile and drone bombardments from Russia that have destroyed critical energy plants in the war-torn country. And we are then told that Zelensky, speaking at the 3C summit in Vilnius, in Lithuania, complained that Ukraine had fallen into a routine in which it suffers Russian air attacks and then pleads for more air defenses from Western partners who promised to deliver them but failed to deliver. Missiles are striking every day, and every day that we hear that Ukraine will receive new air defense systems. Every day, Russian terrorists cut off the electricity to Kharkov and our other cities. And every day, we hear that new aid is coming soon. The reality must finally match the words. And then we are told that Josep Borrell, ardent, fervent supporter of Ukraine, the EU's chief diplomat, said this week it was inconceivable that Western countries could not provide 7 extra Patriot batteries to Ukraine, given that they had about 100 in their arsenal, which they could spare. They can spare 100. They can give away all their Patriot air defense batteries. And then we're told that Kiev is lobbying for air defense systems in Poland, Romania, and Spain to be sent to Ukraine, and that Dmytro Kuleba confirmed, that's the foreign minister, on Ukrainian national news late on Thursday that active negotiations were underway with allies about acquiring 2 Patriot and 1 SAMP-T air defense systems. SAMP-T air defense systems, which have not performed at all well, by the way, in the conflict, just saying, in extremely short supply. There's only, I think, there were only about a dozen of them in Europe. I believe 2 have already been supplied to Ukraine, according to the Russians. At least 1 of them has been destroyed, perhaps both of them. One can see the problem. The more of these systems are sent to Ukraine, the more likely they are to be destroyed. And then, of course, we're told by the Financial Times that Ukraine currently has at least 3 Patriot batteries and 1 SAMP-T battery, which it received in 2023. And one person, we're not told which person, said they only need 7, but it's complicated. And the quote, we're then told that the German government has made clear this week it will not provide any more Patriot systems. We will not be able to offer any more systems for the time being, the Defense Ministry said. And Annalena Baerbock, German Foreign Minister, told lawmakers in the Bundestag that talks were going on with other partners in Europe and worldwide to find spare Patriot systems. There are actors worldwide that have the systems. They don't want to give them directly to Ukraine, but via third parties. That's something we're intensively working on to try and achieve as quickly as possible. Now, there is again a complete lack of reality about this, including from Ukraine itself. And this, of course, brings us back to the actual military realities. Now, John Helmer has published, I thought, a really brilliant message on X, I think they're now called. Anyway, he said this: Zelensky's April 5th request for 25 Patriot systems equals 150 to 200 batteries plus 600 to 800 launchers, plus 10 missiles per launcher, would cost $112 billion. And he also says plus 90 US soldiers per system equals 2,250 soldiers to operate these things, which can't defend against Kinjal or KH-69, or, of course, Zircon hypersonic systems. The West has supplied to Ukraine all these spare Patriot missile systems and IRIS-Ts and NASAM systems that exist. If it starts supplying more, then of course it is digging into its own operational inventories. It will be stripping away its own air defense capabilities. we're now told that Ukraine wants 7, but 7 launches. But in reality, Zelensky has not spoken about 7 launches. He says that Ukraine needs 25 Patriot systems, which is 150 to 200 batteries in total, which is more like 600 to 800 launches to cover the whole of Ukraine. Now, of course, it's likely that Zelensky is talking out of the air, but on this occasion, he's probably closer to the truth than the West wants to acknowledge, than these commentators want to acknowledge. Sending 7 more Patriot systems to Ukraine, 7 more Patriot batteries, rather, to Ukraine, which is what we're hearing about, is not going to change the fundamental realities of this missile war. A narrative is being constructed in the West that the collapse of Ukraine's air defense system and of its energy system is somehow the result of weakness and dithering by Western political leaders. Just as a narrative is being spun in the West that Ukraine's military defeats are the product of the drying up of Western aid, specifically funding from the United States. But neither of these claims should fool us. The reality is that there are not enough air defense systems in the West that can plug Ukraine's gaps. And if all the Patriot and other systems that are sent to Ukraine, if Ukraine were to get all of the ones that it is demanding, then the effect would be that Ukraine would still not have enough systems and the West would be further stripped bare. Now, beyond that, of course, deploying 7 batteries of Patriot launchers is a complex operation in itself. People have to be trained to operate them. Helmer talks about American soldiers doing it. Well, that might be true. Probably contractors of some kind. It's far from a straightforward operation. And buying all these launchers, again, from third parties, which is what Annalena Baerbock says, would be a massive operation. Moreover, Patriot launchers, a fact which Western commentators never say, come in a variety of different forms. Some are some of the missiles, some of which date from the 1980s, by the way, are focused on shooting down aircraft, others on shooting down ballistic missiles. They're not the same. They're not interchangeable. You would need, if you were to be successful in this kind of missile and air war that the Russians are conducting, you would need to have a much more complex range of missiles. And even then, you would still run into the problem that you don't really have counters to the hypersonic missiles that the Russians are now deploying on the battlefronts. So we should not be fooled by this exercise in spin. We see again the colossal sense of entitlement that the Ukrainians have developed. They were told right at the start of this conflict that the West would, give what it takes to make sure that Ukraine prevailed. And that now means that the Ukrainians believe that they have a right to demand everything, even things that are in short supply or which don't really exist. And Ukraine's supporters, people like Josep Borrell and the many media commentators, people like Julian Hopke. They will write about failures to supply weapons, failures to give money, all of this supposedly explaining why Ukraine is losing, instead of the simple and overwhelming and straightforward fact that Ukraine is losing because the Russians are too strong, that they are too strong in terms of missiles, too strong in the air with their extremely powerful air force, too strong in terms of their air defense system for all the various Western missiles, the Storm Shadows, the Scalp missiles, even the ATACMS missiles, about which we've heard very little, by the way, recently. Anyway, too strong in terms of their air defense system for that to penetrate and achieve any decisive effect. And of course, too strong on the ground. Now, it is to the ground that we will now turn, because bad as the missile war is becoming, and the commentary in the West is now principally about that, the situation on the ground is getting worse all the time for Ukraine. Even in secondary theatres, like the Remivka salient area, where I cannot imagine that the Russians have committed significant forces. We're now getting reports that they've broken in to the village of Urozhaine in the Vremivka salient, one of the two villages that the Ukrainians fought and sacrificed hugely in order to try to capture during the summer offensive. Well, even there it seems that the Russians are making progress, and there's some claims that at some point over the next few weeks the Russians may succeed in capturing both Urozhaine and Staromayorsk. But elsewhere, everywhere else, things are getting really very bad for Ukraine. Now, this morning, there were reports, and these are reports which seem to be coming mainly from Ukrainian sources, though Syriac, one of the top mappers, neutral mapper, but one extremely reliable mapper, they're all saying that the Ukrainians have now been pushed out of the remaining houses in the western fringe of Novomikhailivka, this village to the south of Marinka, where they were clinging on, perhaps a full week, or is it 10 days, since the first reports that Novomikhailivka had fallen to the Russians. They clung onto these buildings to no useful purpose. If Syriac is correct, and he usually is, then it is likely that Novomikhailivka is indeed now fully under Russian control. The Ukrainians have apparently pulled back to this village of Paraskovyevke, immediately to the west of Novomikhailivka. From the maps, it looks like a very small place, perhaps more a hamlet than a village. It's unlikely that the Ukrainians will be able to hold on there for much longer. Probably they will fall back towards this larger village to the west, Konstantinovka. And the battle for Novomikhailivka looks like it's finally over. But perhaps much more dramatic is not what's happening south of Marinka, it's what is happening north of Marinka, where the battle for Krasnogorovka is now incredibly intense. The Russians are bombing and attacking Ukrainian positions in the center of Krasnogorovka. There's some reports that they're starting now to launch attacks on Ukrainian positions in Krasnogorovka from the north, presumably from Nivolskoye. Now that Pervomaisky has fallen, I haven't real confirmation of this, but there's also reports that the Russians have destroyed a bridge over another small river, which was a bridge on a supply road that the Ukrainians have been using to send supplies to Krasnogorovka. Now, the ground apparently starting to harden, There's some reports that it's sufficiently hard now in some places in Donbass for tracked vehicles, for tanks to move across fields. It's possible that the Ukrainians would be able to bypass this bridge and continue to send supplies. But the fact that this bridge has been attacked may suggest that with Pervomaisky and Novolskoy under Russian control, the Russians are now going to be able to, are now preparing a campaign to start cutting the supply roads to the Ukrainian forces still holding out in Krasnogorovka. So an intense battle going on for Krasnogorovka. Ukrainians, no doubt, doubtless suffering losses trying to hold on there. Likely that Krasnogorovka will fall to the Russians fully at some point over the next few weeks, opening the way for more Russian advances towards Kurachovo in the west, even as the Russians, with the fall of Novomikhailovka further south, are positioning themselves to advance on Kurachovo from the southeast as well. So, very bad situation for the Ukrainians there. But even more dramatic and perhaps disastrous for Ukraine is what is happening in the Avdiivka area. The first is that there's apparently now film reports that show that the Russians have indeed not only reached, but have started to break into the village of Umanska, west of Orlovka, that they are, apparently there's been an armored advance, another tank and armored vehicle advance across the fields towards the supply road between Umanska and Yasnobrodivka, which is another village to the south of Umanska. Some reports that the Russians have reached the road. The Ukrainians apparently try to repel this armored advance with drones. We'll see. We'll get the news fairly soon, but one way or the other, the outcome is scarcely in doubt, and also reports that the Russians are advancing from Pervomaisky itself into Netalova, the village immediately to the south of Yasnobrodivka. So this defense line is now clearly crumbling. The Russians don't seem to be stopping at Pervomaisky. I'd assume that their main focus would be clearing up Krasnogorovka to the south. It seems that the Russians feel strong enough to attack and clear Krasnogorovka, whilst at the same time pushing further west through Netailovo, Umansky, and Yasnobrodivka, presumably onwards towards Pokrovsk. Just saying. But, dramatic though the news there is, west of Avdiivka, it's perhaps north of Avdiivka that the news is becoming perhaps more dramatic still. There's been reports that the Russians have advanced further from the railway north of Stepovoy, which they captured some weeks ago now, that they've reached a village called Novobakhmutivka. By the way, just to say, again, confusingly, there are two villages in this area, both called Novobakhmutivka. This is the one on the railway towards Ocheretina, and that puts the Russians very close to Ocheretina itself. Presumably, the Ukrainians will want to defend this village, Novobakhmutivka, but intense fighting appears to be still taking place there. And importantly, it looks as if the Russians now are occupying territory to the north of Berdichi, also that they might be advancing towards Novobakhmutivka from Berdichi, which might be a sign that Ukrainian defense in Berdichi has also collapsed, though there's been no confirmation, if so, of that fact from the Russian Defense Ministry. But anyway, and a big Russian advance along the railway towards Ocheretino. And this, of course, happening in parallel with the Russian advance further east towards east of Novokalinova. I refer to it as a railway. I'm told it's actually a road. There is a road that the Russians are advancing on. The H20 road. The Russians are advancing up the road to the east of Novokalinova and Keramik. And again, even as the Russians work towards outflanking Novokalinova and Keramik and taking Ukrainian positions in a potential vice with an advance up the railway towards Cheretino and an advance up the H20 road towards east of Novokalinova. Anyway, there are reports that the Ukrainians, seeing the ongoing collapse of their positions in this area to the north of Avdiivka, are rushing reinforcements there, drawing, in other words, again, on their reserves, as we see Ukrainians plugging the gaps wherever they can. Now, it's been said many times, it was discussed months ago in the London Times when the battle for Avdiivka itself was still underway, that if the Russians capture first Avdiivka and then Ocheretino, which lies on a hill, then the situation of the Ukrainians will become disastrous, that the way will be open for the Russians to move both towards Pokrovsk from this direction, but also northeastwards towards outflanking the remaining Ukrainian troops holding positions in Donbass, in places like Toretsk and New York and others. And Ocheretino itself apparently lies on a hill. It would be very easy to defend, and it dominates the landscape around. So this is potentially a serious battle. And again, we're getting lots of reports that the Russians are using aircraft, heavy aviation, in a very intense way in these battles. By the way, no sign of the Ukrainian air defense system operating in Avdiivka. And I saw film of, I think it was Russian Mi-28 helicopter gunships now flying over Krasnogorovka. The battle, as I said, is also taking place. And again, there didn't seem to be any counter to their presence from the Ukrainian forces that are trying to defend that town. So we could see that the Russian Air Force, with its terrifying FAB and ODAB precision-guided bombs, is able to operate pretty much at will and is doing so in these directions. Anyway, we've also had further news from the Bakhmut area, to be more precise, from Chasiv Yar. And again, early this morning, the Ukrainian deep state mapping project, and they're also quite an interesting website, by the way. Anyway, they confirmed Russian control of Bogdanovka, the village to the northwest, or northeast rather, of Chasiv Yar. So it now seems conclusive that Bogdanovka has fallen. Deep State is not only a Ukrainian mapping project, but it seems to have some kind of contractual relationship with the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. So its information, while I wouldn't call it absolutely definitive, tends to be fairly reliable and perhaps should be treated as authoritative. I have no doubt that Bogdanovka has fallen. In fact, I am sure it fell some time ago. Anyway, there's also reports that the Russians are now either close to capturing Kalinina, this is the village up to the southwest of Bogdanovka, just north of Chasiv Yar, or that they have actually done so. That might be premature. And I've seen maps which now show Russian forces in the north of Chasiv Yar, encircling the micro district to the east of the canal in what looks like essentially a kind of crescent. This is the forces to the north, Russian forces to the north of the micro district. But we're also getting further reports that the Russians are pushing towards Chasiv Yar from the southeast, from Ivanivska, which fell about 2 weeks ago, if I remember rightly. Krasnoye, as the Russians call it. And there are claims that the Russians are now close to reaching another place called, are now pushing steadily towards, in the direction of a place called Stupochki, which I believe is actually located west of the canal, but to the southern tip, on the southern tip of Chasiv Yar. So if that is the Russian objective, then clearly they are seeking to encircle the micro-district from the south, but it looks like they're planning to cross the canal to the south of Chasiv Yar and to attack Chasiv Yar from the south as well. There's also reports of lots of fighting going on within the micro-district, and I've even seen a map which I find very difficult to read or understand, but it suggests that some parts of the micro-district, increasing parts of the micro-district, are falling under Russian control. The Ukrainians still trying to send reinforcements to the micro-district from Chasiv Yar itself, the main part of Chasiv Yar, west of the canal. Again, I wonder why, actually. I wonder why they are defending the micro-district. Surely it would make more logical sense to pull back. If it is indeed, as it seems is the case, gradually becoming encircled, surely it would make more sense to fall back to Chasiv Yar, west of the canal. There are still some potential lines of retreat, whereas the micro-district apparently depended on one small road leading from Chasiv Yar over the canal into the micro-district, and that little road heavily attacked by the Russians, who were able to bomb and shell it at will. But anyway, I'm not going to speculate on Ukrainian intentions. Anyway, a major crisis for the Ukrainians in this area, or so it seems. And there's also been more reports from the Siversk area, which it's now increasingly looking as if is indeed becoming a major, another major area of Russian attention. The Russians have been pushing northward up a railway towards a railway station and small settlement called Vima, immediately to the south of Siversk. I discussed yesterday how they seem to be advancing and attacking two villages immediately to the west of Siversk. There's lots of reports about the Russians still working to clear Belogorovka to the northwest of Siversk. But the latest reports say that the Russians have now captured, this is Dima, the military summary channel, had a good account of it this morning, that the Russians have now captured a fortified area that the Ukrainians had established on a hill to the southeast of Vima, and that if the Russians controlled this hill, again, it puts them in dominating control of the surrounding landscape and would probably lead to the collapse of Ukrainian positions in this area, in the area south of Siversk. So it does look as if Russians are working towards the capture of Siversk itself. So, if we summarize, major Russian advances in the area of Marinka and Avdiivka, Krasnogorovka, probably by now undefendable. Ukraine suffering hideous losses there. Krasnogorovka certain to fall. The Ukrainian defense line through Netalovo, Yasnobrodovka, and Umanska also in the process of collapsing. The Russians in Umanska perhaps having cut the road between Umanska and Yasnobrodovka, probably advancing in Netalovo as well. The Russians pushing up the railway line towards Ocheretino, north of Avdiivka, even as they work to outflank Novokalinova and Keramik. A disaster, a gathering disaster for the Ukrainians in Chasov Yar, the micro-district, very soon encircled. Bogdanovka now having definitely fallen. At least the Ukrainians admit now that it has fallen. Indications that the Russians are now working towards encircling Chasov Yar, and the Russians also now moving steadily towards Siversk. And again, it's interesting that whereas previously, in earlier periods of the special military operation, one could discuss the Russians having to choose between options. Would they advance towards Chasov Yar, or would they advance towards Siversk? Would they focus on capturing Krasnogorovka, or would they break the Ukrainian defense line to the west through Netalovo, Yasnobrodovka, and Umanska? Well, what we see is that the Russians are strong enough to attack in all of these directions at once, stretching the Ukrainian lines ever further, bombing the Ukrainians relentlessly, the Ukrainians unable to counter, burning through their forces at an accelerating speed. And, of course, we've just had this law that the Ukrainian parliament has passed, supposedly providing for a mobilization. On the back of it, Zelensky is already talking about a new offensive in 2025, which seems ridiculously far-fetched given the operational crisis Ukraine is suffering at the present time. And it's important to say that the forces that the Russians are gathering in Ukraine, the big forces, have still not yet been committed. Most of these operations are being conducted increasingly. Yes, the Russians are starting to deploy more fresh troops, but in the Avdiivka area, for example, it still seems to be the case that the spearheads of the Russian advance there, in places like Netalovo, Yasnobrodovka, Umanska, perhaps also Novokalinovo or Cheretina, Keramik, are units created by the Russian military out of the Donetsk militia. And the fighting in Chasov Yar still seems to be principally the work of the Russian paratroop forces, the airborne troops, and further south of the Chechen and Wagner forces. Wagner forces now becoming increasingly incorporated into the Russian military. So it's still the case that most of the fighting that the Russians are conducting is still being conducted with forces drawn from military units that have been fighting in the area of the special military operation, basically since its commencement. The new forces, the massive reserves that the Russians are building up, the new tank and armored forces, the line infantry with their BMP-3s and their T-72s and T-90 tanks, they have not yet been committed in overwhelming force. And there was a report I saw, I think it was in, I think it was either, well, it was either Dima at the Military Summary Channel, or perhaps it was Simplicius the Thinker, that there's reports that the Russians are now also training up another force of 100,000 men in eastern Siberia. I wonder why they're precisely, by the way. But anyway, that they're building up more and more forces. And one senses that a tidal wave is gradually forming west, or rather east, of these dikes that the Ukrainians have cobbled together in places like, west of Avdiivka, in the Vremovka salient, in Chasov Yar. The dikes are only just holding, and the tidal wave has still not yet come. Now, again, to reiterate, I don't know what the Russian plans are, whether they still plan to pursue aggressive attrition. My sense is that aggressive attrition still has some way to go. They still probably want to capture places like Krasnogorovka, Vuhledar to the south, Chasov Yar, obviously. But the major advance still some way off. But these missile attacks that the Russians are undertaking, these bombing attacks, the destruction of bridges, all of that, pointing increasingly, maybe, to some major Russian move this summer. We'll see. Anyway, I want to just finish this program with one further point. Yesterday, I discussed at length the proposals that Putin is now floating. Istanbul Plus, very tough version of Istanbul, recognition by Ukraine of the loss of major parts of its territories. But anyway, Istanbul Plus, with a threat that if Ukraine doesn't agree to that, then unconditional surrender of Ukraine is the only other option, is the only other alternative that Ukraine faces. Now, the man who spoke about Ukraine facing the prospect of unconditional surrender yesterday, Vasily Nebenzia, has now also said this. He said that if Ukraine accepts Russian demands, then it can still survive as a sovereign independent state. So we see the situation that is now developing. I'm increasingly starting to think that deployment of European troops to fight in Ukraine is a mirage. Macron might think this, but given the overwhelming strength of the Russian military forces, I don't think that this is a realistic option. The very fact that they are struggling to come up with air defense systems. And I'm not even starting again on the long discussion of artillery and all of that. I mean, that presumably acts as a deterrent in itself. But there is still a small window open for Ukraine to seize, if it chooses, in order to try to negotiate. My interpretation of Putin's words to Lukashenko is that at some point over the next few weeks, when the Russians have taken Chasiv Yar, perhaps, when maybe they're at the gates of Pakrovsk, perhaps when they arrive at the Dnieper, Putin intends to contact Lukashenko and convey to the Ukrainians for one last time, the proposals that he has now prepared. And obviously it will be Istanbul plus, loss of the 4 regions. Almost certainly it will include a big buffer zone north of the 4 regions in eastern Ukraine, probably including Kharkiv itself. But it will allow for Ukrainian independence. If Ukraine doesn't agree, well, I've spoken about the tidal wave that is building. It looks to me like it will be submerged. Anyway, that's my program for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget that you can check out our shop, buy yourself the amazing things there, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.